A resignation letter doesn't explode. It lands with a pathetic digital click, swallowed by servers humming in a basement 5 states away. Nolan Hayes stared at the blinking cursor for exactly 4 seconds before pressing send. 10 years of loyalty, 10 years of missed bedtimes and cold dinners, and a son who had stopped running to the door when he heard his father's key in the lock. All of it reduced to a single mouse click at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. He didn't feel free. He felt the floor disappear beneath his feet. The fluorescent lights of the 32nd floor didn't buzz. They hummed. A high, synthetic frequency Nolan felt in his chest before he actually heard it. The spreadsheets on his monitor had blurred into meaningless gray columns hours ago. He pressed send. There was no immediate relief. The movies had lied about that. No sudden lifting of weight. No deep breath of liberated air. Instead, a cold, sharp spike of nausea settled in his stomach. He had a mortgage. He had a 6-year-old son with a mild but persistent respiratory condition that required inhalers costing $80 a pop with insurance. Without insurance, Nolan didn't even want to run the math, but he had run out of choices. The day before, he had missed Max's first parent-teacher conference because a shipment of microprocessors stalled at the Long Beach port. The day before that, he had left Max with Mrs. Gable, the elderly woman downstairs, for 14 hours straight because the Q3 projections were misaligned by 3%. When he finally carried his sleeping son to bed, smelling the stale lavender perfume clinging to the boy's pajamas, something in Nolan's chest snapped. Not a clean break, a jagged, ugly fracture. He stood up. His knees popped. The ergonomic chair rolled back and bumped against the glass partition. He didn't have much to pack. A framed photo of Max, grinning wide with 2 missing front teeth. A brushed steel coffee mug. A 5-year anniversary gift from the company. A half-empty bottle of generic ibuprofen. He dropped them into a stolen copier paper box. The ibuprofen rattled against the mug like a maraca at a funeral. Nolan, he turned. Greg from accounting stood in the aisle, tie crooked, smelling faintly of sour coffee and anxiety. "I'm out, Greg." Nolan didn't offer a smile. "You're taking PTO?" "I resigned." Greg's mouth opened. A thin film of sweat appeared on his upper lip. In the sterile, hyper-competitive ecosystem of Praxis Dynamics, people didn't simply resign. They were transitioned. They were restructured. Voluntary departure was an act of rebellion that made the remaining gears in the machine deeply uncomfortable. "But the quarterly review is Friday," Greg whispered, as though the words were classified. "They can review my empty chair." Nolan hoisted the box. It was shockingly light for 10 years of his life. The walk to the elevator felt like a funeral march where nobody was mourning. A few people looked up from their screens, eyes tracking him for half a second before returning to the safety of their spreadsheets. The elevator doors slid shut, cutting off the hum. The parking garage smelled of damp concrete and exhaust. His 9-year-old sedan sat in the corner, a dull gray smudge beside the gleaming row of Teslas and imported SUVs belonging to the executives. He dumped the box in the passenger seat and started the engine. The belt squealed in protest before settling into a rough idle. Traffic on the I-95 was a sluggish river of metal. A late afternoon storm bruised the sky purple and gray. Nolan drove in silence. The quiet pressed against his eardrums. He ran the numbers in his head. Savings could cover 3 months of rent, 4 if they ate beans and pasta and canceled the internet. After that, free fall. His apartment building was a brick block from the late 70s that had long surrendered to the elements. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and old carpet. Nolan leaned his full weight against the door to push past the warped frame. "Dad." Max sat on the faded brown rug in the living room. A fleet of plastic dinosaurs arranged in a semicircle around a headless action figure. The television played a cartoon at low volume. Nolan set his keys on the counter. The cheap metal clinked against the formica. He walked over and dropped to his knees, ignoring the twinge in both joints, and pulled his son into a hug. Max smelled of synthetic strawberry shampoo and the dusty scent of an elementary school playground. "You're home early," Max said, pulling back to look at him. His dark hair was sticking up at the back. Yeah. Nolan forced a smile. It felt brittle on his face. I'm going to be home a lot more now. Max tilted his head. Did you get fired? Kids possessed a terrifying capacity for cutting straight through pretense. Nolan let out a short, dry laugh. No, I quit. Why? Because, Nolan said, brushing a crumb off Max's shirt. I wanted to play dinosaurs with you. Max seemed to accept this logic. He handed Nolan a plastic triceratops with a chewed flat horn. Okay, you're the veggie. You have to run away from the T-Rex. Nolan took the toy. Its hard edges dug into his palm. He sat on the floor, the rough carpet fibers scratching through his work trousers, and he roared softly for the triceratops, while internally the panic took root and spread through his veins like ice water. He had no plan, no safety net, just this living room, the smell of cabbage seeping through the walls, and a terrifying expanse of empty tomorrows. 3 days later, the rain finally came. Not a gentle shower, an angry, relentless downpour that hammered the single-pane windows and made the glass rattle in its aluminum frames. Water leaked through a crack near the kitchen ceiling, dripping with a rhythmic plink into a plastic mixing bowl Nolan had positioned on the counter. It was Thursday morning, 10:15, a time he usually spent in a glass-walled conference room dissecting slide decks about supply chain optimization. Instead, he stood at his rusted stove scraping scrambled eggs off a cheap Teflon pan. The air was thick with burnt butter and damp wool from sweaters hanging on the drying rack. Max was at school. The apartment was devastatingly quiet, save for the rain and the dripping bowl. Nolan scraped the eggs onto a cracked ceramic plate. He didn't even want them. His stomach was a tight knot of acid and dread. He'd spent the last 2 nights staring at the ceiling, mentally drafting cover letters, refreshing his bank balance on his phone until the screen blurred. The intercom by the door gave a sudden, harsh squawk. Nolan froze, spatula halfway to the sink. Nobody buzzed this apartment. The mail carrier had a key. His neighbors pounded on the door, and he hadn't ordered delivery because delivery cost money. He walked to the beige plastic box and pressed the button. Hello, static hissed. Then a voice, sharp, clear, and completely out of place in this building. Nolan, it's Sloan Abernathy. Buzz me up. The name didn't register for a full 3 seconds. When it did, the air in his lungs evaporated. Sloan Abernathy, Chief Executive Officer of Praxis Dynamics. The woman on the cover of Forbes last month. A billionaire who ran a global logistics empire with the cold precision of a surgical laser. A woman Nolan had only ever seen from 50 feet away at all-hands meetings or on a high-definition monitor. She was standing on his broken concrete stoop. I don't think I caught that, Nolan managed. I know you heard me, Nolan. It's freezing out here. My driver is parked illegally. Floor 3. Correct. Buzz me in. His finger moved on its own, pressing the unlock button. A loud mechanical clack echoed from downstairs. Nolan stepped back from the intercom, panic finally overriding shock. His apartment was a disaster. Legos scattered across the floor like landmines. The couch draped in a stained throw blanket. The smell of burnt eggs overpowering everything. He scrambled, kicking Legos under the coffee table, tossing the eggs in the trash, throwing a dish towel over the mixing bowl. Footsteps sounded in the hallway. Not the heavy drag of his neighbor, Mr. Henderson, the sharp, decisive click-clack of expensive heels on cheap linoleum. Nolan opened his door just as she reached the landing. Sloan Abernathy looked exactly like her magazine profiles, but proximity made her terrifying. Tall, a tailored charcoal trench coat that cost more than his car. Dark hair pulled back in a severe, perfect knot. Raindrops clung to her shoulders, glistening under the hallway's flickering fluorescent bulb. Her eyes were pale, icy blue. They held no warmth, but they held an intense, almost uncomfortable level of focus. They swept over him once. Faded sweatpants, a t-shirt with a bleach stain at the hem, 3 days of dark stubble. Mr. Hayes, she said. Her voice was lower in person, gravel around the edges. Miss Abernathy. He stood in the doorway, not intentionally blocking her, but simply because his brain refused to process the protocol for inviting a billionaire into a squalid apartment. She raised one perfectly arched eyebrow. Are you going to make me stand in the hall? It smells like decomposing onions out here. Cabbage, Nolan corrected automatically. It's cabbage. He stepped back. Sloane stepped inside. The moment she crossed the threshold, the smallness of the apartment became magnified. She seemed to consume all the available oxygen. She paused on the threadbare entry rug, took in the space, the headless action figure on the TV stand, the stack of past-due medical bills on the dining table, the mixing bowl on the counter. Plink. A drop of water hit the plastic. Nice acoustics, Sloane said, turning to face him. Nolan crossed his arms, feeling intensely self-conscious, and then suddenly, intensely angry. The shock was wearing off, leaving a raw, defensive burn underneath. What are you doing here? He asked. He didn't offer her a seat. He didn't offer coffee. Sloane reached into her coat pocket and produced a folded sheath of papers. She held them out. Nolan didn't take them. He recognized the company letterhead. Your exit interview, Sloane said, lowering her hand when he didn't reach for it. Or rather, the 4-page addendum you attached to the standard HR resignation form. Nolan felt a flush of heat climb his neck. When HR sent the automated exit survey, he had been fueled by 10 years of repressed fury and 2 glasses of cheap whiskey at 1 in the morning. He hadn't just complained about the hours. He had mapped out, with mathematical precision, exactly how Praxis's Prometheus supply chain algorithm was causing driver burnout, inflating warehouse error rates, and bleeding the company millions in hidden shrinkage, all while punishing the mid-level managers holding the broken system together. He never thought anyone would read it. You read it, Nolan said, keeping his voice flat. My assistant flags anything over 1,000 words. I read it yesterday at midnight. Again this morning at 6. Her icy gaze locked onto his face. You wrote that the Prometheus protocol is, and I'm quoting, a digital meat grinder designed by people who have never lifted anything heavier than a macchiato, structurally engineered to fail the moment a human being needs a break. Nolan shifted his weight. I was drinking when I wrote that. The phrasing lacks professionalism. The phrasing, Sloane said, her voice dropping, is poetry. But more importantly, Nolan, the math is right. He blinked. What? You cross-referenced the shrink rates in the Midwest hubs against mandated overtime hours. You proved a direct correlation between the forced routing and the mechanical failure rates. Across the fleet. She paused, jaw tightening. You proved what I have suspected for 3 months. While my VP of engineering swore it was just adaptation friction. So you came to my apartment to thank me, Nolan said, cynicism dripping from every word. You could have sent a gift card. Sloane's expression didn't shift, but a muscle feathered in her jaw. She looked around the room again, the squalor, the damp, the unmistakable markers of a man standing at the edge of a financial cliff. She walked to the small circular dining table and, to Nolan's absolute shock, sat down. The wobbly chair groaned under her weight. She rested her hands on her lap. I came to find out why a man who understands the fundamental flaws of a billion-dollar grade infrastructure better than its own architects was wasting his life in a cubicle, pushing spreadsheets, and why he chose to quit instead of fixing it. The smell of stale coffee and damp plaster hung heavy between them. Nolan stared at the billionaire, perched on a chair he'd bought at a garage sale for $4. She looked like a hawk balanced on a chain-link fence in a junkyard. I was a mid-level logistics coordinator, Miss Abernathy, he said, leaning against the kitchen counter. I wasn't paid to fix the architecture. I was paid to run the reports. And clearly you stopped wanting to do that. I stopped being able to. The aggression in his voice slipped, replaced by grinding exhaustion. I have a son. He's 6. I haven't seen him awake for more than an hour a day in 8 months. The algorithm you bought to save the company was demanding 50-hour weeks just to keep the baseline functional. Then 60, then 70. Sloane watched him. Her gaze wasn't sympathetic. It was forensic. She was cataloging his posture, his tone, the shadows beneath his eyes. You think I don't know the human cost of scale? She asked quietly. I think, Nolan said, pointing a finger at her, that you look at a dashboard and see red numbers and green numbers. I see the people who sacrifice their marriages, their health, and their kids to turn the red numbers green. So don't sit in my kitchen and act like we're solving a puzzle together. You built a machine that eats people. I just decided I didn't want to be chewed up anymore. The silence that followed was thick. Only the rain against the glass and the steady plink into the bowl. Sloane didn't flinch. She reached out and touched the edge of the table. The wood was deeply gouged in one corner, where Max had once used a fork as a hammer. She ran her manicured thumbnail over the groove. When I took over Praxis 3 years ago, she began, her voice stripped of its sharp edge, the board gave me a mandate. Cut operational costs by 20%, or they would dismantle the company and sell the fleets to private equity. Thousands of people would lose their jobs. She looked up. I authorized Prometheus, because the projections showed a 22% efficiency gain. I didn't build a machine to eat people, Nolan. I built a lifeboat. But right now, the lifeboat is taking on water, and the engineers who built it are too busy protecting their egos to find the leak. And you expect me to care? I expect you to want to work, she said bluntly. You don't have a job. You have past due medical bills on your table. You live in a building that violates half a dozen municipal codes. And you have a child who, judging by the pediatric nebulizer on your bathroom counter, requires expensive health care. Nolan pushed off the counter and took a step toward her. Don't bring my son into this. You don't know anything about my life. Sloane stood up. She was nearly as tall as he was, and she did not back down. The air between them crackled with sudden, volatile energy. I know that pride doesn't pay for albuterol, she fired back, voice low and hard. I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. The system failed you. It failed your son, but you're smart enough to know that hiding in this damp apartment doesn't fix anything. Nolan clenched his fists at his sides. What do you want, Sloane? He used her first name, stripped away the corporate distance. She noticed. The corner of her mouth twitched. I want you to come back, she said. Not as a logistics coordinator, she continued before he could object. I am firing the VP of engineering this afternoon. The entire department is a toxic echo chamber. I need someone who actually understands how the warehouse floor communicates with the routing nodes. Someone who knows exactly why the system fails when a human being needs to take a break. Nolan let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. You want to put a mid-level manager in charge of a complete systemic overhaul? The board will crucify you. Let me worry about the board. She held his gaze. Director of Systems Integration. You report directly to me, nobody else. Full authority to rewrite the routing parameters, implement hard caps on driver hours, and restructure hub communications. Before Nolan could formulate a response, the front door rattled. The handle turned. Mrs. Gable stood in the doorway, clutching a dripping umbrella. Beside her stood Max, in his bright yellow raincoat, holding a soggy piece of construction paper, boots leaving muddy tracks across the linoleum. They let them out early, Mrs. Gable wheezed. Power went out at the school. Max stepped inside. He looked at Nolan. Then his eyes slid to the tall, imposing stranger standing in the center of the living room. Sloane Abernathy, billionaire, CEO, ruthless board negotiator, turned slowly to face the 6-year-old. The professional combat in the room shifted instantly into jarring domestic reality. She looked at Max with the rigid, cautious posture of someone encountering unexploded ordnance. Max blinked his large, dark eyes. He wiped a raindrop off his nose with the back of his hand. Are you the landlord? He asked. Because my dad says the landlord is a blood-sucking leech. But you don't look like a bug. Nolan closed his eyes. He genuinely prayed for the floor to open. A heavy silence fell. He opened his eyes, waiting for the billionaire to turn on her expensive heel and walk out, offended and finished with this chaotic circus. Instead, Sloane looked down at her leather boots, then back at the boy. No, she said, her gravelly voice surprisingly gentle, completely free of adult-to-child baby talk. I'm not a leech. I'm your father's boss. Oh, Max said. He frowned at his boots. He doesn't like you. Mrs. Gable gasped. Nolan pressed his fingers against his temples. Max, please go take off your wet boots. It's all right, Sloane said. She took one step toward Max. She didn't crouch down. She clearly didn't know how to bridge that physical gap, but she leaned forward slightly. Why doesn't he like me? Max looked at Nolan for permission. Nolan gave a defeated nod. Because, Max said, holding up his soggy piece of construction paper, you make him stare at a glowing box all night, and then he gets sad, and then we can't play dinosaurs. The unvarnished truth hung in the air, smelling of wet cardboard and rain. Sloane absorbed it. She didn't look away from the boy. For one fleeting second, the cold, impenetrable mask fractured. Nolan saw something raw flash in her pale eyes, a profound, staggering guilt. It was there, and then it was suppressed, pushed beneath years of corporate conditioning. She slowly straightened. She turned her gaze back to Nolan. The defensive hostility that had armored him moments ago felt suddenly useless. They were just two tired people standing in a leaky room, confronted by the collateral damage of a broken machine. He's right, Sloane said softly. I did do that. She reached into her coat pocket, produced a sleek silver pen, uncapped it, and walked to the dining table. She picked up a blank sheet from the back of an unpaid electric bill and wrote down a number. She set the pen beside it. I'm not asking you to forgive the company, Nolan, she said, her voice regaining a fraction of its steel, tempered now with quiet desperation. I'm asking you to help me fix it, so it doesn't happen to anyone else. She walked toward the door. She paused beside Max, looked down at him. Nice raincoat, she said stiffly. Thanks, Max mumbled. Sloane opened the door. The smell of cabbage and wet hallway rushed back in. She looked over her shoulder. My direct line is on that paper. Call me by 5. The latch clicked. She was gone. Nolan stood still for a long moment. Rain hammered the glass. The drip found its rhythm. He walked to the table and looked at the paper. Beside the 10-digit phone number, she had written a salary. He stared at the zeros. Enough to move them out of this building. Enough to buy the inhalers out of pocket 100 times over. Enough to buy back his life. But more than the money, it was the authority to rip the algorithm apart with his bare hands. Dad, Max asked, tugging his sweatpants, is she going to fire you again? Nolan picked up the paper. It felt heavy with the weight of impending, terrifying change. He looked at his son and noticed the slight wheeze in the boy's breathing from the damp air. No one's firing anyone, Nolan said, a strange, fierce spark igniting in his chest. I think she just handed me a sledgehammer. The 52nd floor smelled of lemon polish and aggressively cold recycled air. Nolan's new access badge hung from a lanyard around his neck, a heavy piece of encrypted plastic that no longer felt like a collar. He pressed it against the security panel outside the executive boardroom. The light blinked green. 12 engineers sat around the mahogany table in fitted slacks and quarter-zip sweaters, laptops open, radiating defensive hostility. At the head sat Sloane, hands steepled, giving nothing away. You're late, Mr. Hayes. Traffic. He didn't apologize. He dropped his battered leather briefcase onto the polished wood, with a deliberate thud that made a junior developer flinch. He uncapped a red dry erase marker and turned to the massive glass whiteboard spanning the full length of the wall. Your routing logic is garbage, he said to the room, skipping the introduction. You built a 5-minute staging buffer for the Chicago hub, a loading dock that takes 12 minutes to clear on a dry day. A senior architect named Peterson leaned forward, face flushed. The algorithm dynamically adjusts based on historical load times. The friction is a localized user error issue on the floor. Nolan turned. He locked eyes with Peterson. Have you ever driven a forklift? Silence. The HVAC hum became deafening. Have you ever tried to maneuver 3 tons of palletized electronics across concrete slick with hydraulic fluid while a scanner on your wrist vibrates every 10 seconds, telling you're behind schedule? Nolan didn't raise his voice, but the tremor of controlled fury bled into every syllable. It's not localized friction. It's physiological reality. When humans panic, they drop things. When they drop things, the line stops. Your dynamic adjustment doesn't account for human adrenaline or exhaustion. It just punishes the driver. He turned back to the board and started writing. Raw numbers. No slides. He mapped the cascading failure points. The phantom shrinkage caused by rush scanning, the fleet maintenance costs from pushing vehicles past redline, the warehouse turnover bleeding the company dry. His handwriting was jagged and imperfect, but the math was undeniable. For 45 minutes, he dismantled their billion-dollar architecture piece by piece. He stripped away the buzzwords and the synergy and the agile optimization language and exposed the bleeding, exhausted arteries underneath. When he finally dropped the marker onto the aluminum tray, the clatter echoed. He was breathing hard. His hands were shaking slightly. He looked at Sloane. She hadn't moved. Her pale eyes tracked the red ink on the glass. Then she shifted her gaze to Peterson. "Can you refute this?" Peterson opened his mouth, closed it. His jaw was tight. It would require a fundamental rewrite of the staging protocols. Hard limits on driver utilization would drop our efficiency metric by 8%, which eliminates the mechanical breakdowns and warehouse turnover currently costing us 15, Nolan said, wiping red ink off his thumb. Sloane stood up. The scrape of her chair was sharp in the quiet room. She walked slowly to the whiteboard and stood shoulder to shoulder with Nolan. She smelled faintly of jasmine and black tea. "Rewrite it," she ordered, looking out at the room. "Miss Abernathy, the board. I will handle the board." She cut Peterson off cleanly. "You have 3 weeks to integrate Mr. Hayes's parameters. If the system demands a human being skip a meal to hit a metric, you scrap the code and start over. Am I clear?" Reluctant, fractured murmurs of assent rippled around the table. When the last engineer filed out, only Nolan and Sloane remained. He leaned against the table, bone-tired, the adrenaline crashing and leaving him hollow. Sloane picked up the red marker and turned it slowly in her manicured fingers. "You sweat through your shirt. I'm not a public speaker." "You were brutal," she corrected. She capped the marker with a sharp snap. It was exactly what they needed. She looked at him. For the second time since they met, the armor cracked. A genuine, tired smile touched the corner of her mouth. "Get some sleep, Nolan. The sledgehammer part is over. Tomorrow we have to rebuild the walls." 3 months later, the August heat baked the asphalt outside, but the 48th floor remained sealed in its 68-degree chill. Nolan sat in his new office, the leather chair giving a rich squeak when he shifted. He stared at his monitors. The bleeding red columns that had governed his blood pressure for a decade were gone, replaced by a steady amber glow. The Prometheus patch was live, not a miracle, a tourniquet, but the hemorrhaging had stopped. The heavy glass door clicked open. Sloane leaned against the jamb, a loose black sweater replacing her usual structured blazer. In each hand, a crystal tumbler. Ice chimed as she walked in and set one beside his keyboard. The condensation pooled immediately on the mahogany. "You're violating your own mandatory downtime parameters," she noted, the ragged edge of a 70-hour week in her voice. Nolan picked up the glass. The bourbon smelled of charred oak and damp earth. "Denver hub is lagging by 4 minutes. Denver is breathing," she corrected. She leaned against the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the haze-smudged skyline. The cynical armor she usually wore was stripped down to its frame, leaving only the bone-deep exhaustion they now both shared. "The board saw the shrink reports today. You bought us a quarter, maybe 2. "I bought the driver's time to eat lunch," Nolan muttered, taking a sip. His phone buzzed against the desk. A FaceTime request. He tapped the screen. Max's face filled the frame, cheeks smeared with what looked suspiciously like chocolate. But, more importantly, the persistent wheeze that used to underscores his breathing was entirely absent. "Dad," Max demanded loudly. "Mrs. Gable says I have to go to bed, but we didn't finish the Lego rover." Sloane stepped behind Nolan's chair. She stared at the screen, an unreadable tension tightening her jaw. She still didn't know how to exist inside this domestic sphere. "Hello, Max," she said, stiffly. Max narrowed his eyes at the camera. "Are you the boss lady?" "I am." "Did you make my dad do the glowing box thing again?" Sloane let out a short, dry exhale that might have been a laugh. "No, I'm actually kicking him out of the building right now." Max considered this. "Okay, tell him to drive fast. Bye." The screen went black. Nolan set the phone down. Silence settled back into the room, thick and complicated. He looked at the empty screen, then at Sloane. She was staring at his desk. at the crude crayon drawing of a green dinosaur taped to the edge of his monitor. "Go home, Nolan," she murmured. He drained the bourbon, the ice hitting his teeth, and stood up. He grabbed his worn jacket. The security badge slapped against his chest as he moved. It no longer felt like a dog tag. As he walked toward the elevator, leaving the billionaire alone in the quiet, humming tower, he understood something clearly for the first time. The machine was still a machine, vast and inherently hungry, but for the first time in 10 years, his hand was resting firmly on the kill switch, and this time, he had no intention of letting go.